We're going to be painting this little watercolor painting here of a lion, and the first thing that I've gone ahead and done is drawn a really nice loose outline of the lion's face, eyes and his ears, etc. And also I used a little bit of masking fluid right here just to mask out some of his whiskers. So you can do that, that's optional, and if you don't want to use masking fluid, then I'm going to show you another technique as well later on when we get to that stage of the painting where we can go ahead and use some white watercolor or gouache just to paint those in on top. We're going to want to go ahead and start mixing up some color just to put down some layers around his face here. So I'm just using a little puddle here of water and a flat brush. And I'm going to take some yellow ochre right here. Now if you don't have this particular color, then I'm going to show you another way to mix this up. You can take this brown here, make a little puddle of this. This color is called burnt sienna. It's kind of this reddish brown. And we can go ahead and just use a little bit of yellow right here and mix that in to that puddle, and you get a color that's pretty much the same. Okay, so what we want to do in the first stage is to take some clear water and just begin to put the water down on the paper. And you can see what I'm doing is working around the area around his nose and also some of the fur around his ears and around the side of his face. And I'm just going to paint in the clear water just from my water jar. We're not going to be putting down any paint in the beginning, just the clear water. And what that does is it will help to prepare the paper to accept the first wash. And remember, we're always going to be working from light to dark when we are working with watercolor. And then I'm just going to go straight into one of these puddles of paint and start stroking in some of this color. And this is a really good base color. And also we want to put some color on his ears and right around here. You can be very spontaneous with the first layer because you are going to be painting darker washes and different colors over the top. And also right around the mouth. Now notice how I'm not putting any color really around the mouth. And I'm not focusing too much on the eyes right now and just allowing the color really just to flow on the paper using this very thin wash. So I've used just a little bit of paint from my palette and lots of water because we really want to get a nice light color in, and just allowing that to flow right there on the paper. And then of course just softening everything. I'm going to dip my brush right back into the water and then go ahead and soften that edge right there. Okay, so just remember that anytime you're working with watercolor and perhaps you end up putting too much color on, or it wasn't exactly where you wanted the watercolor to go on the paper, because watercolors are a very spontaneous medium. So what you can do is just take a little bit of a paper towel or maybe even just a tissue, and then you can blot out that color and you can see what happens. It's kind of like an eraser, and right here I'm going to keep this kind of light, so I'm just pulling that color out and pressing into the paper. So that's a really good technique that you can use for that. Now we're going to come back in and take a look at building up some other color. I'm going to go right back in to my brown right here. Now this brown has a lot of red in it, so This is called burnt sienna, this color here. If you don't have a color like this, then I'm just going to use a different brown here, make another puddle. And if I want to change that color, I can just go into some of my red or even my orange. And notice how it changes that brown just by adding that orange. Now all of a sudden I get a color that's very similar to the one next to it. So that's one way that you can mix up a reddish brown, is by putting some orange into your puddle. Alright, so now we have this wash and it still is very wet. So this would be a very good time to take a smaller brush or to simply use the tip of your brush. And I really am just painting some strokes of color for the mane. You want to start building up some of these layers of color. And then also right above here. Putting a little bit of color right here as well on the ears. And then I'm going to go back into my yellow ochre. And then I'm going to create some color right on the center. And also on the sides of the mouth. And because this layer is still really wet, we get this really nice soft fuzzy edge. And that's because the paper is nice and damp. And put some more of his mane. You notice how I'm just using the tip of my brush to go ahead and paint some strokes of color in. And you can also use the back of your brush if you just want to get some more definition on some of the lion's mane. Then instead of actually using paint, you can come in and just press into the paper while the watercolor paper is still very wet. Right in here. Okay. And then I'm going to take some more of this brown and mix a puddle using a smaller brush, and I'm going to work right around the eyes. And you can see how we're getting a nice soft edge because the paper is still wet. Now if you find that your paint spreads a little bit too much, which can sometimes happen with watercolor, then you can simply come with your paper towel and just pull it out by pressing into the paper. You can see how I did that. I'm just painting it back in. And then I'm also going to come back into this nose here and paint some of my darker brown. And you can see how I'm getting that nice soft edge. And that can be really nice to have that effect working on the damp paper, because we really want to capture some of the softness that we see with the lion's fur. Okay. So what I'm going to do right now is just allow this entire layer to dry. And one option, if you want this to dry faster, you can go ahead and use a hairdryer, and that will that way you don't have to wait as long before you go back and paint the next layer. Okay, so we went ahead and dried off this layer, and now we're ready to come back and start building up some more layers. This is when you can start adding a little bit more detail. So I'm going to rinse my brush off now in some water, and this time we can grab some black, and I'm going to mix a puddle of it here, and then I'm also going to dip my brush in some brown. Okay, and this will be a really good color for his nose, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do is come back over the top with another layer. So we already have a soft kind of lighter layer of some brown underneath, and now we're coming back to just add a little bit more definition, kind of creating this V shape right here for the nose and then pulling it out right here. Okay, and then now I'm going to rinse my brush out and come and soften the edge right in here. And then underneath here, I'm just going to create a couple of little lines right there. And then we also want to start looking at the mouth and adding some color to that. So I'm going to do the same thing, just put some water down here. And then go right into some red. Now you want to mix a lot of water with your red, and then see how you get this nice soft color? That's because we're using a lot of water for the very first layer. And this is going to be really important to get that expression of our lion roaring. And then I also want to use my paper towel in case I need to lift out any color, because that went right over where the teeth are. So just remember that your paper towel is a lot like an eraser. And I do see that on these teeth there we have some color, and so I put a little bit of that brown right there just for the first layer, and we're just going to really let that dry. And we're going to come back into our dark color, which is our black with a little bit of our brown. And I want to go ahead and just put down a lighter layer of that just to start getting in a little bit of color around his mouth, and then also up into this area here. And I'm working directly on the dry paper. Now I'm just going to use a little bit of water on my brush and come and soften the edge. And see what that does when you add water. If you put down that color first and then you come back with water, this helps everything to blend together. And just remember, once again, if it starts running and blending too much, don't worry about it, because you can always use that paper towel just to pull the color out. Now remember that anytime you use paper towel or a tissue, it won't work if the color has already dried. So you want to remember to work fast, just pulling that color out right away, because it's a lot like an eraser. And here I am just softening everything and blending it together. I'm now going to reach for a smaller brush. I'm going to take a little bit more of my black and then a little bit of my brown, mixing those colors together right here on my palette. And this time we want to put some definition around the outside of those eyes, because when you're painting your lion, it's so important that we get those eyes in, because it's really going to bring out his character. So I'm just painting that in and pulling the color downwards and right around here, painting in the perimeter. And of course a little bit of water just so we soften it and it can blend in with some of the other fur. I'm going to just leave this alone right now, and then I'm going to go back into this other color that I have on my palette. I told you guys about before, it's called Yellow Ochre, and really it is just a mix of brown with some yellow. It's kind of like a really good earthy color for painting in the fur and some of the areas around the mouth on our lion. And what I'm doing right now is just spreading this, and then we'll also bring some color over here on the other side, softening all of those edges. I'm deciding right now also to take a little bit of my paper towel and just pulling out a little bit of color so it's a little bit lighter. I'm not playing with it too much, just dabbing it. Alright. Just getting in a little bit more of this really good color for around our lion's eyes. We really want to get some of that expression. Alright, now he's got some kind of wrinkles around his nose that are really important. So I'm going to pre-wet the paper a little bit, and then I'm going to come back into some more color right in here. And then I just want to go ahead and put some strokes of color there. And then I'm going to allow this just to dry off for a little. Now we're going to start introducing some different colors so that we get some really nice shadows and some accents. And what we're going to do is mix up some blue and then take a little bit of red. So we have a bluish purple, kind of a bit of a gray tinge to it. And I'm going to show you what I'm going to do with this color. There's a bit of a shadow right underneath his mouth. So I'm putting in some of this purple color. And that might seem like an unusual color, but it really will blend in with some of the brown. And you can see that already gives us a little bit of definition as far as some shadows. And you do want to use water with that and kind of move that around. You notice how right around this part of his mouth here, the lower part, I'm kind of leaving that really light because that's where we're going to see the shadow. And then also using the tip of my brush so we kind of get that effect of his fur. And I'm also pushing the brush different directions because that's exactly what his fur looks like. And then we're also going to come and put some of this darker shadow color right in here. And then I'm going to soften this line and just pull the color up and out. And going back to the shadow color again, we are going to use the tip of this brush just to create some creases right in here. And then up over this way. I'm also going to use this color to soften along here and then add a little bit of this. Okay. And then I'm going to darken this layer. So let's come back and take some more of our blue with a little bit of our red so we get kind of a grayish purple, because we definitely want to build up some darker color right next to his mouth. And we'll allow that to dry off. Now we want to come back in and make the sides of his mouth a little bit darker. So I'm going to take some brown and some black, mixing those colors together. Just remembering with watercolor, always going from your light and then slowly building up all of those colors to get the definition. Right in here, I'm pulling this up and around, and then also a couple of little strokes in here and in the side area. Pulling this down. And also I'm definitely seeing that we want to build up some color around these teeth. These teeth are so important that we get those for the expression on his face. And so what I'm doing is going really slowly right now, and I'm working around the white area of these really sharp teeth, and some of these teeth are in the front, painting in this little dark area that almost looks like a triangle. See that? And we're also going to paint in another area right in here, and just go ahead and fill that in. I'm also seeing another area where we could do the same thing, just pulling the color around but painting right around those shapes that are those teeth. It's going to be really important to giving our lion this expression. And also right in and around this shape, filling in all of these gaps. And then just using the tip of the brush to pull this color around. Now what I'm going to do is take a little corner of my paper towel and just pull out some of these edges right there. Let's go for some blue. Now you wouldn't think that blue would be a good color, but it really works with the black and the brown. It kind of merges with that because it's a dark value and just adds a little bit more drama to his mouth. Okay. Kind of darkening up all of those areas right there. And then we can go back and take a look at the eyes. I think let's use some yellow ochre, which is yellow and brown mixed together. And I'm going to start adding some of that color. You want to leave a little tiny white space because there's a highlight on the lion's eye. And you want to go ahead and do the same thing. And we're going to let that dry before we put the black pupil in. I'm also going to take just a wee bit of some green on my brush, and then I'm going to add that into the yellow ochre, kind of softening these edges right in here. You can go ahead and just let that dry. Now I'm going to mix up some more of our yellow and brown, so we get kind of like this really nice bright golden color that will be really good for bringing out some of the accents of his fur. So I'm going to just put this right here, start layering this, and some on the other side as well. And I'm using these quick little dashes just to kind of create that. We also want to put a little bit of color on top here because we want to indicate some of the shapes for the lion's ears, which are really just these little curvy shapes. And you're not seeing his entire ear because he's got so much fur. So once again, just putting down some clear water and then going back into some of these different shades of brown and some of our gold. And I'm just creating strokes of color. Remember that at this stage, if you want to put a little bit more definition, you can always use the back of your brush and scrape into the wet paper, and what that does is create little lines and curves. So instead of having to use paint, you can actually scrape into the paper, and what happens is some of the paint goes into these grooves and actually gives us some really great texture. Now I'm going to move over to a smaller brush because I want to put some detail in the eyes, so I'm going to take some black. Now just remember, you can use paint for this. You can even use a skinny little Sharpie marker to go ahead and paint those little black dots, the pupil, because look how important it is to get that expression right there. Really makes those eyes start to stand out. And then of course I want to use my brush with some more of this gold color because I want to put a few more strokes next to the eyes so we get some of that really nice texture. And you can also put water on your brush just to soften some of those strokes so it all blends in. I can also see that on the nose, because he's roaring and we want to get in that expression, that I'm using curvy strokes to create some of these wrinkles around the nose, and really they're just little curvy shapes, little lines right around the upper part here. And once I have that down, I'm going to come back in with the clear water and soften some of those edges so it blends with everything underneath. Right in here. I'm going to come back in too and put a few more of these strokes of some brown right next to the sides of his face, and then also grab some more dark brown and mix that in with our yellowish brown, and now we have a different color that we're adding, and we're actually mixing that color right here on the page. Some more color, and we're just, you know, really working on some of the final details. You want to really make sure we get that expression. So at this stage I am coming back in with different shades of brown and creating these little dashes using the point of my brush, going different directions, because we want to get the real effect of some of the fur that we're seeing. And of course also the expression of our lion's face. Put a few more strokes of color right around these eyes. Right in there is a little bit darker. And you want to go ahead too and take some red with a little bit of blue mixed in, because we want to darken up some of the shading that we see right here on the lion's tongue, and of course just cover that whole area. I also added a little bit of very light brown to some of the tops of the teeth, because even though they're white, they still have a little bit of shadow on them. And they're just adding some more colors right around the mouth. Now I'm going to also use my brush and just create some little dashes to represent the fur right beneath his chin, because that's so important. We really want to emphasize some of that texture. Okay, we're just going to let this dry. Okay, so we're just going to work on a couple more final touches, and I'm going to show you what to do if you want to create some of the whiskers or even the little highlights on the lion's eye. So you can take some white paint, some white watercolor, and using a small brush, you want to go ahead and use the tip. And what I'm doing now is just creating these little lines. It's a really good idea to do this once everything is dried off. And you want to get some of that pure white paint and just start painting in some of those whiskers. Remember to use the point of the brush. That will just really help you. Notice how I'm just pulling that color out. And then you can take some of that white, and I can definitely see a couple of little highlights right in here. And you want to look for any other places where maybe some of the fur is really, really light. There could be some sunlight on his fur, and so maybe you want to go ahead and create some of these little tiny dashes. And I'm using some right below his mouth, because it's definitely, some of the fur there is lighter right along the edge of the mouth, and so I'm just creating these little tiny lines, and you can see how that brings definition to that area. Or the other thing that you can use white paint for is maybe you've created an area where it might be a little bit too dark and you want to just lighten it up, like on the edges here of the mouth. And that's exactly what I'm doing, is just putting some little dashes for some of that fur. Okay, so really we're just about finished with our lion, and there's one other place that we could create some other definition, and I'm just going to use some brown here on my brush. I thoroughly rinsed my brush off, and right next to where these whiskers are, I see some little dots, and I'm really just going ahead and taking the tip of my brush and creating a row of these little dots next to where he has those whiskers right in here, just a few of those. Now that really helps to give some of the detail. And I am using a little bit of water on my brush just to soften some of those areas of paint, those little dots, so it's not quite as dark and it kind of blends more with his area around his mouth. And also I do see on the edge of the mouth there's a little bit of a shadow, so really what I'm doing is putting some more brown paint and then just going ahead and doing the same thing, which is just softening that out with some water. So we're pretty much finished now. I think I could probably put a couple more of these whiskers just by taking the tip of the brush and then extending that line all the way across and maybe coming across. Notice how some of these little lines, these whiskers, intersect. It makes those look a little bit more realistic. So really, I'm completely finished with this painting. This was a really fun project. We're going to go ahead and sign this one and basically call this a finish. So yeah, that was a great project.